Welcome everyone. I got my headband on. My bangs are pretty long right now, but welcome. This will likely end up being a shorter stream, only because I have like 5 of the fairy tales bookmarked, and they're not that long. They're really not that long, but they're like ones that like you would recognize, like Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Rumpelstiltskin, Little Red Riding Hood, basically. So figured I'd like pick those rather than ones. I'm not saying the rest of them aren't good. Just that these are ones that I know people know at least know the Disney versions of the fairy tales. Like I said, the fairy tales themselves are short. So, but look, this is the book. All right, this is how thick it is. This is all right, and I marked the stories already, basically. So I'm just going to go in the order they are in, basically, in the book. So it'll be starting with Cinderella. But welcome, everyone. Hope you enjoy the reading. Oh, there's a lot of fairy tales. There's a lot. What's next to read after this? Well, I have H.P. Lovecraft stories. I can really look through this book to see if there's any other fairy tales that most people don't know too well, to see maybe there's someone like I can read more of. I have the Edgar Allan Poe short stories as well. I got a few things. I got a few things I can dive into. Basically, I figure the H.P. Lovecraft stories, at least those, will probably be on the longest side. So that way, I might be able to put push those out to a little bit, for more than one stream. Hold on, before. Hold on. How about it this way? I'll put a copy of Dracula on my throne. I don't want to use the annotated version just because, that's my dad's copy. So I don't want to use that one. But I'm not saying I expect anyone to. But if someone purchases it for me on my throne, and it's not going to be an expensive copy. It's just if I'm gifted it, then I'll find a way to add it to the rotation. Maybe not. We'll see. We'll see, because it is kind of on the long side, so I might read it for October, or I might read it after Return of the King, basically, because it is kind of on the long side when it comes to books. So, but anyway, so the first fairy tale we have is Cinderella. Now, I know the messed up elements to this tale. I don't know how many other people do. Okay, but here it is, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, I saw that, Mike Hill. I talked about it, so yeah. The wife of a rich man fell sick, and as she felt that her end was drawing near, she called her only daughter to her bedside and said, "Dear child, be good and pious, and then the good God will always protect thee, and I will look down on thee from heaven and be near thee." Thereupon she closed her eyes and departed. Every day the maiden went out to her mother's grave and wept, and she remained pious and good. When winter came, the snow spread a white sheet over the grave, and when the spring sun had drawn it off again, the man had taken another wife. The woman had brought 2 daughters into the house with her, who were beautiful and fair of face, but vile and black of heart. Now began a bad time for the poor stepchild. "Is the stupid goose to sit in the parlor with us?" said they. "He who wants to eat bread must earn it. Out with the kitchen wench." They took her pretty clothes away from her, put an old gray bedgown on her, and gave her wooden shoes. "Just look at the proud princess, how decked out she is," they cried and laughed, and led her into the kitchen. There she had to do hard work from morning till night, to get up before daybreak, to carry water, light fires, cook and wash. Besides this, the sisters did every imaginable injury. They mocked her, and emptied her peas and lentils into the ashes, so that she was forced to sit and pick them out again. In the evening, when she had worked till she was weary, she had no bed to go to, but had to sleep by the fireside in the ashes. And as on that account she always looked dusty and dirty, they called her Cinderella. It happened that the father was once going to the fair, and he asked his 2 stepdaughters what he should bring back for them. "Beautiful dresses," said one. "Pearls and jewels," said the second. And thou, Cinderella, said he, what wilt thou have? Father, break off for me the first branch which knocks against your hat on your way home. So he bought beautiful dresses, pearls, and jewels for his two stepdaughters, and on his way home, as he was riding through a green thicket, a hazel twig brushed against him and knocked off his hat. Then he broke off the branch and took it with him. When he reached home, he gave his stepdaughters the things which they had wished for, and to Cinderella he gave the branch from the hazel bush. Cinderella thanked him, went to her mother's grave and planted the branch on it, and wept so much that the tears fell down on it and watered it. It grew, however, and became a handsome tree. Thrice a day Cinderella went and sat beneath it and wept and prayed. And a little white bird always came on the tree, and if Cinderella expressed a wish, the bird threw down to her what she had wished for. It happened, however, that the king appointed a festival which was to last 3 days, and to which all the beautiful young girls in the country were invited, in order that his son might choose himself a bride. When the two stepsisters heard that they too were to appear among the number, they were delighted, called Cinderella and said, "Comb our hair for us, brush our shoes, and fasten our buckles, for we are going to the festival at the king's palace." Cinderella obeyed, but wept because she too would have liked to go with them to the dance, and begged her stepmother to allow her to do so. "Thou go, Cinderella," said she. "Thou art dusty and dirty, and wouldst go to the festival. Thou hast no clothes and shoes, and yet wouldst dance." As, however, Cinderella went on asking, the stepmother at last said, "I have emptied a dish of lentils into the ashes for thee. If thou hast picked them out again in 2 hours, thou shalt go with us." The maiden went through the back door into the garden and called, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me to pick the good into the pots, the bad into the crop." Then 2 white pigeons came in by the kitchen window, and afterwards the turtle doves, and at last all the birds beneath the sky came whirring and crowding in, and alighted amongst the ashes. And the pigeons nodded with their heads and began pick, 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 and the rest began also pick, 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 and gathered all the good grains into the dish. Hardly had 1 hour passed before they had finished, and all flew out again. Then the girl took the dish to her stepmother, and was glad, and believed that now she would be allowed to go with them to the festival. But the stepmother said, "No, Cinderella, thou hast no clothes, and thou canst not dance. Thou wouldst only be laughed at." And as Cinderella wept at this, the stepmother said, "If thou canst pick 2 dishes of lentils out of the ashes for me in 1 hour, thou shalt go with us." And she thought to herself, that she most certainly cannot do. When the stepmother had emptied the 2 dishes of lentils amongst the ashes, the maiden went through the back door into the garden and cried, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me to pick the good into the pot, the bad into the crop." Then 2 white pigeons came in by the kitchen window, and afterwards the turtle doves, and at length all the birds beneath the sky came whirring and crowding in, and alighted amongst the ashes. And the doves nodded with their heads, and began to pick, 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 and the others began to also pick, 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 and gathered all the good seeds into the dishes. And before half an hour was over, they had already finished, and all flew out again. Then the maiden carried the dishes to the stepmother, and was delighted, and believed that she might now go with them to the festival. But the stepmother said, "All this will not help thee. Thou goest not with us, for thou hast no clothes, and canst not dance. We should be ashamed of thee." On this she turned her back on Cinderella, and hurried away with her 2 proud daughters. As no one was now at home, Cinderella went to her mother's grave beneath the hazel tree, and cried, "Shiver and quiver, little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." Then the bird threw a gold and silver dress down to her, and slippers embroidered with silk and silver. She put on the dress with all speed and went to the festival. Her stepsisters and the stepmother, however, did not know her, and thought she must be a foreign princess, for she looked so beautiful in the golden dress. They never once thought of Cinderella, and believed that she was sitting at home in the dirt, picking lentils out of the ashes. The prince went to meet her, took her by the hand, and danced with her. He would dance with no other maiden, and never left loose of her hand. And if anyone else came to invite her, he said, "This is my partner." She danced till it was evening, and then she wanted to go home. But the king's son said, "I will go with thee and bear thee company," for he wished to see to whom the beautiful maiden belonged. She escaped from him, however, and sprang into the pigeon house. The king's son waited until her father came, and then told him that the stranger maiden had leapt into the pigeon house. The old man thought, "Can it be Cinderella?" And they had to bring him an axe and a pickaxe that he might hew the pigeon house to pieces, but no one was inside it. And when they got home, Cinderella lay in her dirty clothes among the ashes, and a dim little oil lamp was burning on the mantelpiece, for Cinderella had jumped quickly down from the back of the pigeon house, and had run to the little hazel tree, and there she had taken off her beautiful clothes and laid them on the grave. And the bird had taken them away again. and then she had placed herself in the kitchen amongst the ashes in her gray gown. Next day, when the festival began afresh, and her parents and the stepsisters had gone once more, Cinderella went to the hazel tree and said, "Shiver and quiver, little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." Then the bird threw down a much more beautiful dress than on the preceding day, and when Cinderella appeared at the festival in this dress, everyone was astonished at her beauty. The king's son had waited until she came, and instantly took her by the hand and danced with no one but her. When others came and invited her, he said, "She is my partner." When evening came, she wished to leave, and the king's son followed her and wanted to see into which house she went, but she sprang away from him and into the garden behind the house. Therein stood a beautiful tall tree on which hung the most magnificent pears. She clambered so nimbly between the branches like a squirrel that the king's son did not know where she was gone. He waited until her father came and said to him, "The stranger maiden has escaped from me, and I believe she has climbed up the pear tree." The father thought, "Can it be Cinderella?" And an axe brought and cut the tree down, but no one was on it. And when they got into the kitchen, Cinderella lay there amongst the ashes as usual, for she had jumped down on the other side of the tree, had taken the beautiful dress to the bird on the little hazel tree, and put on her own gray gown. On the third day, when the parents and sisters had gone away, Cinderella went once more to her mother's grave and said to the little tree, "Shiver and quiver, little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." And now the bird threw down to her a dress which was more splendid and magnificent than any she had yet had, and the slippers were golden. And when she went to the festival in the dress, no one knew how to speak for astonishment. The king's son danced with her only, and if anyone invited her to dance, he said, "She is my partner." When evening came, Cinderella wished to leave, and the king's son was anxious to go with her, but she escaped from him so quickly that he could not follow her. The king's son had, however, used a stratagem, and had caused the whole staircase to be smeared with pitch, and there, when she ran down, had the maiden's left slipper remained sticking. The king's son picked it up, and it was small and dainty and all golden. Next morning he went with it to the father and said to him, "No one shall be my wife, but she whose foot this golden slipper fits." Basically, as if every woman's, no other woman could have that size shoe. Then were the two sisters glad, for they had pretty feet. The eldest went with the shoe into her room and wanted to try it on, and her mother stood by, but she could not get her big toe into it, and the shoe was too small for her. Then her mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut the toe off. When thou art queen, thou wilt have no more need to go on foot." The maiden cut the toe off, forced the foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. Then he took her on his horse as his bride, and rode away with her. They were, however, obliged to pass the grave, and there, on the hazel tree, sat the two pigeons and cried, turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe is too small for her. The true bride waits for you." Then he looked at her foot and saw how the blood was streaming from it. He turned his horse around and took the false bride home again, and said she was not the true one, and that the other sister was to put the shoe on. Then this one went into her chamber and got her toes safely into the shoe, but her heel was too large. So her mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut a bit off thy heel. When thou art queen, thou wilt have no more need to go on foot." The maiden cut a bit of her heel, forced her foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. He took her on his horse as his bride, and rode away with her. But when they passed the hazel tree, two little pigeons sat on it and cried, turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe is too small for her. The true bride waits for you." He looked down at her foot and saw how the blood was running out of her shoe, and how it had stained her white stocking. Then he turned his horse and took the false bride home again. "This also is not the right one," said he. "Have you no other daughter?" "No," said the man. There is still a little stunted kitchen wench, which my late wife left behind her, but she cannot possibly be the bride." Such a good father. The king's son said that he was to send her up to him, but the mother answered, "Oh no, she is much too dirty. She cannot show herself." He absolutely insisted on it, and Cinderella had to be called. She first washed her hands and face clean, and then went and bowed down before the king's son, who gave her the golden shoe. Then she seated herself on a stool, drew her foot out of the heavy wooden shoe, and put it into the slipper, which fitted like a glove. And when she rose up and the king's son looked into her face, he recognized the beautiful maiden who had danced with him and cried, "This is the true bride." The stepmother and the two sisters were terrified and became pale with rage. He, however, took Cinderella on his horse and rode away with her. As they passed the hazel tree, the two white doves cried, turn and peep, no blood is in the shoe. The shoe is not too small for her, the true bride rides with you. And when they had cried that, the two came flying down and placed themselves on Cinderella's shoulders, one on the right, the other on the left, and remained sitting there. When the wedding with the king's son had to be celebrated, the two false sisters came and wanted to get into favor with Cinderella and share her good fortune. When the betrothed couple went to church, the elder was at the right side and the younger at the left, and the pigeons pecked out one eye of each of them. Afterwards, as they came back, the elder was at the left and the younger was at the right, and then the pigeons pecked out the other eye of each. And thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness as long as they lived. Told you these aren't the Disney versions. And thus ends Cinderella. The next one I have marked is Little Red Riding Hood. So yeah, not only did these two stepsisters cut off parts of their feet to fit into the shoe, pigeons pecked out their eyes when they tried to get in good with Cinderella. So, alright, Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, there was a dear little girl who was loved by everyone who looked at her, but most of all by her grandmother, and there was nothing that she would not have given to the child. Once she gave her little cap of red velvet, which suited her so well that she would never wear anything else, so she was always called Little Red Riding Hood. One day her mother said to her, "Come, Little Red Riding Hood, here's a piece of cake and a bottle of wine. Take them to your grandmother. She is ill and weak, and they will do her good. Set out before it gets hot, and when you're going, walk nicely and quietly, and do not run off the path, for you may fall and break the bottle, and then your grandmother will get nothing. And when you go into her room, don't forget to say good morning, and don't peep into every corner before you do it." "I will take great care," said Little Red Riding Hood to her mother, and gave her hand on it. The grandmother lived out in the wood, half a league from the village, and just as Little Red Riding Hood entered the wood, a wolf met her. Red Riding Hood did not know what a wicked creature he was, and was not at all afraid of him. Excuse me, hiccups. "Good day, Little Red Riding Hood," said he. "Thank you kindly, wolf." Whither away so early, Little Red Riding Hood?" "To my grandmother's." "What have you got in your apron?" "Cake and wine. Yesterday was baking day, so poor sick grandmother is to have something good to make her stronger." "Where does grandmother live, Little Red Riding Hood?" "A good quarter of a league farther on in the wood. Her house stands under the 3 large oak trees. The nut trees are just below. You surely must know it," replied Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf thought to himself, "What a tender young creature! What a nice plump mouthful! She will be better to eat than the old woman. I must act craftily so as to catch both." So he walked for a short time by the side of Little Red Riding Hood, and then he said, "See, Little Red Riding Hood, how pretty the flowers are about here. Why do you not look around? I believe, too, that you do not hear how sweetly the little birds are singing. You walk gravely along as if you were going to school, while everything else out here in the wood is merry." Little Red Riding Hood raised her eyes, and when she saw the sunbeams dancing here and there through the trees, and pretty flowers growing everywhere, she thought, "Suppose I take grandmother a fresh nosegay? That would please her, too. It is so early in the day that I shall still get there in good time." And so she ran from the path into the wood to look for flowers. And whenever she had picked one, she fancied that she saw a little prettier one farther on, and ran after it, and so got deeper and deeper into the wood. I believe it was Jam. Because there's other wolf tales. Like fairy tales and so forth. Meanwhile, the wolf ran straight to the grandmother's house and knocked at the door. "Who is there?" "Little Red Riding Hood," replied the wolf. "She is bringing cake and wine. Open the door." "Lift the latch," called the grandmother. "I am too weak and cannot get up." The wolf lifted the latch, the door flew open, and without saying a word, he went straight to the grandmother's bed and devoured her. Then he put on her clothes, dressed himself in her cap, laid himself in bed, and drew the curtains. Little Red Riding Hood, however, had been running about picking flowers, and when she had gathered so many she could carry no more, she remembered her grandmother, and set out on the way to her. She was surprised to find the cottage door standing open, and when she went into the room, she had such a strange feeling that she said to herself, "Oh dear, how uneasy I feel today, and at other times I like being with grandmother so much. She called out, "Good morning," but received no answer, so she went to the bed and drew back the curtains. There lay her grandmother, with the cap pulled far over her face, and looking very strange. "Oh, grandmother," she said, "what big eyes you have, or what big ears you have." "The better to hear you with, my child," was the reply. "But grandmother, what big eyes you have," she said. "The better to see you with, my dear." "But grandmother, what large hands you have, the better to hug you with." "Oh, but grandmother, what a terrible big mouth you have, the better to eat you with." And scarcely had the wolf said this, than with one bound he was out of bed and swallowed up Red Riding Hood. When the wolf had appeased his appetite, he lay down again in the bed, fell asleep, and began to snore very loudly. The huntsman was just passing the house and thought to himself, "How the old woman is snoring! I must just see if she wants anything." So he went into the room, and when he came to the bed, he saw that the wolf was lying in it. "Do I find thee here, thou old sinner?" said he. "I have long sought thee." Then, just as he was going to fire at him, it occurred to him that the wolf might have devoured the grandmother, and that she might still be saved. So he did not fire, but took a pair of scissors and began to cut open the stomach of the sleeping wolf. When he had made 2 snips, he saw Little Red Riding Hood shining, and then he made 2 snips more, and the little girl sprang out, crying, "Ah, how frightened I have been! How dark it was inside the wolf!" And after that, the aged grandmother came out alive also, but scarcely able to breathe. Red Riding Hood, however, quickly fetched the great stones with which they filled the wolf's body, and when he woke, he wanted to run away, but the stones were so heavy he fell down at once and fell dead. Then all 3 were delighted. The huntsman drew off the wolf's skin and went home with it. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine which Red Riding Hood had brought and revived. But Red Riding Hood thought to herself, "As long as I live, I will never by myself leave the paths to run into the wood, when my mother has forbidden me to do so." It is also related that once when Red Riding Hood was again taking cakes to the old grandmother, another wolf spoke to her and tried to entice her from the path. Red Riding Hood, however, was on her guard, and went straight forward on her way, and told her grandmother that she had met the wolf, and that he had said good morning to her, but with such a wicked look in his eyes, that if they had not been on the public road, she was certain he would have eaten her up. "Well," said grandmother, "we will shut the door, that he may not come in." Soon afterwards the wolf knocked, and cried, "Open the door, grandmother, I am Little Red Riding Hood, and am fetching you some cakes." But they did not speak, or open the door, so the grey beard stole twice or thrice around the house, and at last jumped onto the roof, intending to wait until Red Riding Hood went home in the evening, and then to steal her and devour her in the darkness. But the grandmother saw what was in his thoughts. In front of the house was a great stone trough, so she said to the child, Take the pail, Red Riding Hood. I made some sausages yesterday, so carry the water into which I boiled them to the trough." Red Riding Hood carried until the great trough was quite full. Then the smell of the sausages reached the wolf, and he sniffed and peeped down, and at last stretched out his neck so far he could no longer keep his footing, and began to slip, and slipped down from the roof straight into the great trough and was drowned. But Red Riding Hood went joyously home, and never did anything to harm anyone, except kill, a wolf. And that is Little Red Riding Hood. And Granny was hitting the juice. So, one wolf was killed by the huntsman. Well, by the huntsman, Red Riding Hood, and Granny. The other was basically drowned. So, I told you, pretty dark. Anyway, Rumpelstiltskin. I'm sure you've all heard of Rumpelstiltskin. Once there was a miller who was poor, but who had a beautiful daughter. Now it happened that he had to go and speak to the king, and in order to make himself appear important, he said to him, "I have a daughter who can spin straw into gold." The king said to the miller, "That is an art which pleases me well. If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her tomorrow to my palace, and I will try what she can do." And when the girl was brought to him, he took her into a room which was quite full of straw, gave her a spinning wheel and a reel, and said, "Now set to work, and if by tomorrow morning early you have not spun the straw into gold during the night, you must die." Thereupon he himself locked up the room and left her in it alone. "Thanks, Dad." So there sat the poor miller's daughter, and for the life of her could not tell what to do. She had no idea how the straw could be spun into gold, and she grew more and more miserable, until at last she began to weep. But all at once the door opened, and in came a little man, and said, "Good evening, Mistress Miller. Why are you crying so?" Alas, she answered the girl, I have to spin straw into gold, and I do not know how to do it. What will you give me? Said the mannequin, if I do it for you. My necklace, said the girl. The little man took the necklace, seated himself in front of the wheel, and whir, 3 turns, and the reel was full. Then he put another on, and whir, 3 times round, and the second was full too. And so it went on until morning, and when all the straw was spun, and all the reels were full of gold. By daybreak the king was already there, and when he saw the gold he was astonished and delighted, but his heart became only more greedy. Had the miller's daughter taken into another room full of straw, which was much larger, and commanded her to spin that also in one night if she valued her life. The girl knew not how to help herself, and was crying when the door opened again, and the little man appeared and said, What will you give me if I spin that straw into gold for you? The ring on my finger, answered the girl. The little man took the ring, again, began to turn the wheel, and by morning had spun all the straw into glittering gold. The king rejoiced beyond measure at the sight, but still he had not gold enough, and he had the miller's daughter taken to a still larger room full of straw, and said, You must spin this too in the course of this night, but if you succeed, you shall be my wife. Even if she be a miller's daughter, thought he, I could not find a richer wife in the whole world. When the girl was alone, the mannequin came again for the third time, and said, What will you give me if I spin the straw for you this time also? I have nothing left that I could give, answered the girl. Then promise me, if you should become queen, your first child. Who knows whether that will ever happen, thought the miller's daughter, and not knowing how else to help herself in this straits, she promised the mannequin what he wanted, and for that he once more spun the straw into gold. And when the king came in the morning and found all as he had wished, he took her in marriage, and the pretty miller's daughter became a queen. A year after, she had a beautiful child, and she never gave a thought to the mannequin, but suddenly he came into her room and said, Now give me what you promised. The queen was horror-struck, and offered the mannequin all the riches of the kingdom if he would leave her to the child. But the mannequin said, No, something that is living is dearer to me than all the treasures in the world. Then the queen began to weep and cry, so that the mannequin pitied her. I will give you 3 days' time, said he. If by that time you find out my name, then shall you keep your child. So the queen thought the whole night of all the names that she had ever heard, and sent a messenger over the country to inquire, for far and wide, for any other names there might be. When the mannequin came the next day, she began with Casper, Malachor, Balthazar, and said all the names she knew, one after another. But to every one the little man said, That is not my name. On the second day, she had inquiries made in the neighborhood as to the names of the people there, and she repeated it to the mannequin, the most common and curious. Perhaps your name is Short Ribs, or Sheepshanks, or Lace Leg, but he always answered, That is not my name. On the third day, the messenger came back again and said, I have not been able to find a single new name, but as I came to a high mountain at the end of the forest, where the fox and the hare bid each other good night, there I saw a little house, and before the house a fire was burning, and around about the fire, quite a ridiculous little man was jumping. He hopped upon one leg and shouted, Today I bake, tomorrow brew, the next I'll have the young queen's child. Glad am I that no one knew that Rumpelstiltskin I am styled. You may think how glad the queen was when she heard that name. And when soon afterwards the little man came in and asked, Now, Mistress Queen, what is my name? At first she said, Is your name Conrad? No. Is your name Harry? No. Perhaps your name is Rumpelstiltskin. The devil has told you that! The devil has told you that! Cried the little man, and in his anger he plunged his right foot so deep into the earth that his whole leg went in, and then in a rage he pulled at his left leg so hard that with both hands that he tore himself in two. I don't think anybody remembers that with Rumpelstiltskin. And that ends Rumpelstiltskin. That's one of the short ones. Alright. On to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So, yeah. There is a version of Rumpelstiltskin. Has, Billy Barty in it. I don't know if anybody remembers Billy Barty. He's a little person actor, or was a little person actor. Now you'd probably would know him more from Willow, basically. He was, like, the leader of, the village. And he played Rumpelstiltskin in this version, right? If I can find it, maybe I'll show it to you guys. Like it's like a small Discord watch party, basically. But I remember that version. It's one of the first versions I ever watched of Rumpelstiltskin. Was the one with Billy Barty in it. It's not that long. I don't remember being like very long at all. But he plays Rumpelstiltskin. So, but anyway, on to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Once upon a time in the middle of winter, when the flakes of snow were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat at a window, sewing. And the frame of the window was made of black ebony. And while she was sewing and looking out of the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. And the red looked pretty upon the white snow, and she thought to herself, "Would that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the window frame." Soon after that, she had a little daughter who was as white as snow and as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony, and she was therefore called Little Snow White. And when the child was born, the queen died. Oh yeah, Gravy. Like, I'm pretty sure, like, you look up images of Rumpelstiltskin, like, he would pop up. So. After a year had passed, the king took to himself another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty, and she could not bear that anyone else should surpass her in beauty. She had a wonderful looking glass, and when she stood in front of it and looked at herself in it and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The looking glass answered, "Thou, O queen, art the fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew that the looking glass spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up, and grew more and more beautiful, and when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the day, and more beautiful than the queen herself. And once when the queen asked her looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" it answered, "Thou art fairer than all who are here, Lady Queen, but more beautiful still is Snow White, as I ween." Then the queen was shocked, and turned yellow and green with envy. From that hour, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart heaved in her breast, she hated the girl so much. And envy and pride grew higher and higher in her heart, like a weed, so that she had no peace day or night. She called a huntsman and said, "Take the child away into the forest. I will no longer have her in my sight. Kill her and bring me back her heart as a token." The huntsman obeyed and took her away, but when he had drawn his knife and was about to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and said, "Ah, dear huntsman, leave me my life. I will run away into the wild forest and never come home again." And as she was so beautiful, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Run away then, you poor child. The wild beast will soon have devoured you," thought he, and yet it seemed as if a stone had been rolled from his heart, since it was no longer needful for him to kill her. And as a young boar just then came running by, he stabbed it, and cut out its heart, and took it to the queen, as proof that the child was dead. The cook had to salt this, and the wicked queen ate it, and thought she had eaten the heart of Snow White. But now the poor child was all alone in the great forest, and so terrified that she looked at every leaf of every tree, and did not know what to do. Then she began to run, and ran over sharp stones and through thorns, and the wild beast ran past her, but did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would go until it was almost evening. Then she saw a little cottage, and went into it to rest herself. Everything in the cottage was small, but neater and cleaner than can be told. There was a table on which was a white cover and 7 little plates, and on each plate a little spoon. Moreover, there was 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, and covered with snow-white counterpanes. Little Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate some vegetables and bread from each plate, and drank the drop of wine out of each mug, for she did not wish to take all from one only. Then, as she was so tired, she laid herself down on one of the little beds, but none of them suited her. One was too long, another too short, but at last she found that the 7th one was right, and so she remained in it, and said a prayer, and went to sleep. When it was quite dark, the owners of the cottage came back. They were 7 dwarves who dug and delved in the mountains for ore. They lit their 7 candles, and as was now light within the cottage, they saw that someone had been there, for everything was not in the same order in which they had left it. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" The second, "Who has been eating off my plates?" The third, "Who has been taking some of my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The 7th, "Who has been drinking out of my mug?" Then the first looked around and saw that there was a little hole on his bed. He said, "Who has been getting into my bed?" The others came up and each called out, "Somebody has been lying in my bed too." But the seventh, when he looked at his bed, saw little Snow White, who was lying asleep therein. And he called the others who came running up, and they cried out with astonishment, and brought their 7 little candles, and let the light fall on little Snow White. When it was morning, little Snow White awoke, and was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarfs. But they were friendly, and asked her what her name was. "My name is Snow White," she answered. "How have you come to our house?" said the dwarfs. And then she told them that her stepmother had wished to have her killed, but that the huntsman had spared her life, and that she had run for the whole day until at last she had found their dwelling. The dwarf said, "If you will take care of our house, cook and make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and if you will keep everything neat and clean, you can stay with us, and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart," and she stayed with them. She kept the house in order for them. In the mornings they went to the mountains and looked for copper and gold. In the evenings they came back, and then their supper had to be ready. The girl was alone the whole day, so the good dwarfs warned her and said, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here. Be sure to let no one come in." But the queen, believing that she had eaten Snow White's heart, could not but think that she was again the first and most beautiful of all. And she went to her looking glass and said, looking glass, on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." Then she was astounded, for she knew that the looking glass never spoke falsely, and she knew that the huntsman had betrayed her, and the little Snow White was still alive. And so she thought again how she might kill her, for so long as she was not the fairest in the whole land, envy let her have no rest. And when she had at last thought of something to do, she painted her face, and dressed herself up like an old peddler woman, and no one could have known her. In this disguise she went over the 7 mountains to 7 dwarves, knocked at the door, and cried, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap, very cheap." Little Snow White looked out the window and called out, "Good day, my good woman, what have you to sell?" "Good things, pretty things," she answered, "stay laces of all colors." And she pulled out one, which was woven of bright-colored silk. "I may let the worthy old woman in," thought Snow White, and she unbolted the door and bought the pretty laces. "Child," said the old woman, "what a fright you look! Come, and I will lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicion, but stood before her, and let herself be laced with the new laces. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. "Now I am the most beautiful," said the queen to herself, and ran away. Not long afterwards, in the evening, the 7 dwarfs came home, but how shocked they were when they saw their dear little Snow White lying on the ground, and that she neither stirred nor moved, and seemed to be dead. They lifted her up, and as they saw that she was laced too tightly, they cut the laces. Then she began to breathe a little, and after a while came to life again. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else than the wicked queen. Take care, and let no one come in when we are not with you." But the wicked woman, when she had reached home, went in front of the glass and asked, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And it answered as before, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard that, all the blood rushed to her heart with fear, for she saw plainly that little Snow White was again alive. "But now," she said, "I will think of something that shall put an end to you." And by the help of witchcraft, which she understood, she made a poisonous comb. Then she disguised herself and took the shape of another old woman. So she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, knocked at the door, and cried, "Good things to sell, cheap, cheap." The little Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I cannot let anyone come in." "I suppose you can look," said the old woman, and pulled the poisonous comb out and held it up. It pleased the girl so well that she let herself be beguiled, and opened the door. When they had made a bargain, the old woman said, "Now I will comb you properly for once." Poor little Snow White had no suspicion, and let the old woman do as she pleased. For hardly had she put the comb in her hair that the poison in it took effect, and the girl fell down senseless. "You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "you are done for now," and she went away. But fortunately, it was almost evening when the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying as if dead upon the ground, they at once suspected the stepmother, and they took and found the poisoned comb. Scarcely had they taken it out when Snow White came to herself and told them what had happened. Then they warned her once more to be upon her guard and to open the door to no one. The queen at home was in front of the glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" Then it answered, as before, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard the glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with rage. "Snow White shall die," she cried, "even if it cost me my life." Thereupon she went into a secret, lonely room where no one ever came, and there she made a very poisonous apple. Outside it looked pretty, white with a red cheek, so that everyone who saw it longed for it, but whoever ate a piece of it must surely die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and dressed herself up as a countrywoman. And so she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I cannot let anyone in, and the seven dwarfs have forbidden me." "It's all the same to me," answered the woman. "I shall soon get rid of my apples. There, I will give you one." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the old woman. "Look, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You eat the red cheek, and I will eat the white." The apple was so cunningly made that the red cheek was poisoned. Snow White longed for the fine apple, and when she saw that the woman ate part of it, she could resist no longer, and stretched out her hand and took the poisonous half. But hardly had she bit of it in her mouth than she fell down dead. Then the woman looked at her with a dreadful look and laughed aloud and said, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood. This time the dwarfs cannot wake you up again." And when she asked the looking glass at home, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" It answered at last, "O Queen, in this land thou art fairest of all." Then her envious heart had rest, so far as an envious heart can have rest. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying upon the ground. She breathed no longer and was dead. They lifted her up, looked at her to see where they could find anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but it was of all no use. The poor child was dead and remained dead. They laid her upon a briar, and all 7 sat around it and wept for her and wept 3 days long. Then they were going to bury her, but she still looked as if she were living, and still had a pretty red cheeks. They said, "We could not bury her in the dark ground," and they had a transparent coffin of glass made, so that she could be seen from all sides, and they laid her in it, and wrote her name upon it in golden letters, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they put the coffin upon the mountain, and one of them always stayed by it and watched it. And birds came too and wept for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and at last a dove. And Snow White lay a long, long time in the coffin, and she did not change, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son came into the forest, and went to the dwarf's house to spend the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain, and the beautiful Snow White within it, and read what was written upon it in gold letters. And he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, I will give you whatever you want for it." But the dwarfs answered, "We will not part with it for all the gold in the world." Then he said, "Let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession." Classy. As he spoke in this way, the good dwarfs took pity upon him and gave him the coffin. And now the king's son had it carried away by his servants on their shoulders, and it happened that they stumbled over a tree stump, and with the shock the poisonous piece of apple which Snow White had bitten off came out of her throat. And before long she opened her eyes, lifted up the lid of the coffin, and sat up, and was once more alive. "Oh heavens, where am I?" she cried. The king's son, full of joy, said, "You were with me," and told her what had happened, and said, "I love you more than everything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace. You shall be my wife." Works quickly. And Snow White was willing, and went with them, and their wedding was held with great show and splendor. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast. When she had arrayed herself in beautiful clothes and went before the looking glass, she said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" Glass answered, O queen of all here, the fairest art thou, but the young queen is fairer by far, as I trow." Then the wicked woman uttered a curse, and was so wretched, so utterly wretched, that she knew not what to do. At first she would not go to the wedding at all, but she had no peace, and must go to see the young queen. And when she went in, she knew Snow White, and stood still in the rage and fear, and could not stir. But iron slippers had already been put up upon the fire, and they were brought in with tongs, and set before her. Then she was forced to put on the red-hot shoes, and dance until she dropped down dead. So, yeah. So she's forced to wear red-hot shoes and dance until she dropped dead. Literally. Alright, lastly, chat. Most likely jam. Lastly, and like I said, I was just reading these in order, so I didn't have any particular order in mind than what they were in the book. Sleeping Beauty. Alright? Again, not the Disney version. Like I said, all Hollywood would have to do is adapt the actual fairy tales themselves into live action for a horror story. Anyway, this is one that probably shouldn't be adapted to live action, and you'll see why. If I remember correctly, there's a part in this that are like, whoa. Even I'm like, ee. Alright. Alright. Oh, cool, Jam. A long time ago, there was a king and queen who said every day, "Ah, if only we had a child." But they never had one. But it happened that once when the queen was bathing, a frog crept out of the water onto the land and said to her, "Your wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year has gone by, you shall have a daughter." What the frog had said came true, and the queen had a little girl who was so pretty that the king could not contain himself for joy, and ordered a great feast. He invited not only his kindred, friends, and acquaintances, but also the wise women, in order that they might be kind and well disposed towards the child. Not necessarily fairies, wise women. There were 13 of them in his kingdom, but as he had only 12 golden plates for them to eat out of, one of them had to be left at home. Guess which one? The feast was held with all manner of splendor, and when it came to an end, the wise women bestowed their magic gifts upon the baby. One gave virtue, another beauty, a third riches, and so on with everything in the world that one can ever wish for. When 11 of them had made their promises, suddenly the 13th came in. She wished to avenge herself for not having been invited, and without greeting, or even looking at anyone, she cried with a loud voice, "The king's daughter shall in her 15th year prick herself with a spindle and fall down dead." And without saying a word more, she turned around and left the room. They were all shocked, but the 12th, whose good wish still remained unspoken, came forward, and as she could not undo the evil sentence, but only soften it, she said, "It shall not be death, but a deep sleep of 100 years, into which the princess shall fall." The king, who would fain keep his dear child from the misfortune, gave orders that every spindle in the whole kingdom should be burnt. Meanwhile, the gifts of the wise women were plenteously fulfilled on the young girl, for she was so beautiful, modest, good-natured, and wise that everyone who saw her was so bound to love her. It happened that on the very day when she was 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home, and the maiden was left in the palace quite alone. So she went around in all the sorts of places, looked into rooms and bedchambers just to see light, and at last came to an old tower. She climbed up the narrow, winding staircase and reached the little door. A rusty key was in the lock, and when she turned, the door sprang open, and there in the little room sat an old woman with a spindle, busily spinning her flax. You're talking about Maleficent? I did not bother watching it. I generally don't like when villains are portrayed as sympathetic necessarily, especially Maleficent. Come on, this is Maleficent. She cursed a child because she wasn't invited to a party. I mean, there's nothing sympathetic about that. Anyway, moving on. "Good day, old dame," said the king's daughter. "What are you doing here? What are you doing there?" "I am spinning," said the old woman, and nodded her head. "What sort of thing is that rattles round so merrily?" said the girl, and she took the spindle and wanted to spin too. But scarcely had she touched the spindle when the magic decree was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger with it. And in the very moment when she felt the prick, she fell down upon the bed that stood there and lay in a deep sleep. And this sleep extended over the whole palace. The king and queen, who had just come home, had entered the great hall, began to go to sleep, and the whole of the court was with them. The horses, too, went to sleep in the stable, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons upon the roof, the flies on the wall. Even the fire that was flaming on the hearth became quiet and slept. The roast meat left off frizzling, and the cook, who was just going to pull the hair of the scullery boy, because he had forgotten something, let him go, and went to sleep. And when the wind fell, and on the trees before the castle, not a leaf moved again. But round about the castle there began to grow a hedge of thorns, which every year became higher, and at last grew close up around the castle and all over it, so that there was nothing of it to be seen, not even a flag upon the roof. But the story of the beautiful sleeping Briar Rose, for so the princess was named, went about the country, so that from time to time king's sons came and tried to get through the thorny hedge to the castle. But they found it impossible, for the thorns held fast together as if they had hands, and the youths were caught in them, and could not get loose again and died a miserable death. After long, long years, a king's son came again to that country and heard an old man talking about the thorn hedge and that a castle was said to stand behind it, in which a wonderfully beautiful princess named Briar Rose had been asleep for 100 years, and that the king and queen and the whole court were asleep likewise. He had heard, too, from his grandfather that many kings' sons had already come and had tried to get through the thorny hedge, but they had remained sticking fast in it, and had died a pitiful death. Then the youth said, "I am not afraid. I will go and see the beautiful Briar Rose." The good old man might dissuade him as he would. He did not listen to his words. But by the time the 100 years had passed, and the day had come when Briar Rose was to wake again, when the king's son came near to the thorn hedge, it was nothing but large and beautiful flowers, which parted from each other of their own accord, and let him pass unhurt. Then they closed again behind him like a hedge. In the castle yard he saw the horses and spotted hounds lying asleep. On the roof sat the pigeons with their heads under their wings. And when he entered the house, the flies were asleep upon the wall. The cook in the kitchen was still holding out his hand to seize the boy, and the maid was sitting by the black hen which he was going to pluck. He went on farther, and in the great hall he saw the whole of the court laying asleep, and by the throne lay the king and queen. Then he went on still farther, and was all quiet that a breath could be heard, and at last he came to the tower, and opened the door into the little room where Briar Rose was sleeping. There she lay, so beautiful that he could not turn his eyes away, and he stooped down and gave her a kiss. But as soon as he kissed her, Briar Rose opened her eyes and awoke, and looked at him quite sweetly. Then they went down together, and the king woke, and the queen, and the whole court, and looked at each other in great astonishment. And the horses in the courtyard stood up and shook themselves. The hounds jumped up and wagged their tails. The pigeons upon the roof pulled out their heads from under their wings, looked around, and flew into the open country. The flies on the wall crept again, and the fire in the kitchen burned up, and flickered and cooked the meat. The joint began to turn and fizzle again, and the cook gave the boy such a box on the ear that he screamed, and the maid plucked the fowl ready for the spit. And then the marriage of the king's son with Briar Rose was celebrated with all splendor, and they lived contented to the end of their days. So if they were to actually do Sleeping Beauty as it was, you would show many princes being killed going to Sleeping Beauty. So happily ever after, but it lasted 100 years, and those who tried died in the thorns. So they wouldn't do that. They're all dying. Well, except for the last one, they all died. So Disney wouldn't make that. Disney would not make that. And those are the tales I picked for you, ladies and gentlemen. So, like I said, fairy tales, like the Disney versions, alright, are not the Grimm's fairy tales. Yeah, there's a different version of that. Hold on, let me look at the fairy tales in here, because I have just about the whole collection in this book. Make sure that I'm remembering correctly. Because I remember hearing a version like that as well, but I have to look through this book. I have to look through the stories, but I do remember that version as well, Soul Assassin. So, but like I said, not the Disney versions. They're pretty dark. But anyway, thank you all, chat. I pretty much, unless the gentleman who's helping me with the thumbnails comes back with anything tweaks he's made to the thumbnails, I do have thumbnails made for the Mortuary Assistant and the game called Shh. Well, what I think I'll do is I'll play the Mortuary Assistant tomorrow. Maybe start that game. We'll see. And then maybe the other game the next day. But I have at least those two thumbnails. And, I'll show you, chat. Hold on, I'll show you. Because there's games that I downloaded demos of that I might play offline or even on stream. You open up Steam. Yeah, I'm going to live stream tomorrow. That's the plan. Just, hold on. Real fast just to show you. Okay, this is my Steam library. Come on. There it is. Okay, so I downloaded this demo I'm going to play. I've seen reels of it, so it looks pretty interesting. I have that demo. This is the one where I can't blink. So I might throw together a thumbnail for this at some point to play, because it's supposed to be a very short game from what I can tell. This demo, this is like, these are from the guys that did Massacre at the Mirage. This is Shh. Literally a game called Shh. That I have that I'll be playing. This one looks really interesting. I have to find a way to add the DLC. I don't know if there's a way to add the DLC to like a wish list, but it's literally a pinball game. And the DLC you can get for it is Camp Bloodbrook, Texas Chainsaw Massacre Pinball, System Shock Pinball, Duke Nukem's Big Shot Pinball, Dead by Daylight Pinball, The Thing Pinball, and Chucky's Killer Pinball. So yeah. So I downloaded that to play. So it's literally a pinball game. This is the Mortuary Assistant, which I'll be playing tomorrow. And I think that's it as far as... And the only other demo... I could have sworn I had the Dread Flats demo. Oh, there it is, yeah, this. This, I'm gonna try. So, I know, but... I know they're all, like, chances are, like, there are already pinball machines, like, are out there. But, like, when I was all about, like, not necessarily all about, but mainly I loved pinball machines. Alright? I would get a 2 or 3 if I could. So, like I said, but I saw that and I was like, you know what? It's free. I believe it was free, pretty much. Like, at least the base game was. Downloaded it. Something to play offline. But like I said, there's a DLC, like different pinball machines. And I don't know how to add the DLC to any wish list, but if you look it up, like Pinball M, you can see it. The DLC pinball machine games. So, but yeah, that is the plan, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said, unless any like tweaks need to be made, I do have the thumbnails for the 2 games I'll be playing, the 2 indie horror games I'll be playing, and then I have those demos that I have. I have a wish list on my Steam. If you go scroll down to, it's called Pinball M. Yeah, let me look at it again. Where is? Yeah, Pinball M. That's what it's called. If I lost my train of thought there. If I stream on Saturday, I'm going to stream on the early side. I should be able to do it, but it'll be on the early side, maybe about like 4 p.m. Eastern, thereabouts. Play for a couple hours or so, because WrestlePalooza starts at like 7 p.m. So yeah, and then I have like other demos, and I have like if you look at my wish list, if you scroll all the way down, you'll see like the indie horror games I added, which I've like like I'm very interested in playing, because I'm starting to gravitate more towards indie devs, because I've just become so disillusioned by AAA studios. AA is not bad. AA is like, yeah, it can be hit and miss, but they're not like bad. AAA, I've become so delusioned with AAA games. Basically, it's just so I think I'm gonna play Chronos. I'll just be playing it offline, unless I can find the perfect settings for it so it doesn't stutter with the frames, like the optimization doesn't, like, go up and down. I might be able, might return to it. But I gotta like figure out what to do. Anyway, yeah, but I'm getting to more playing indie games than anything. Well, it crashes my stream when the shaders are just loading, it crashes my stream. So I don't know what's going on. It's just the shaders. Anyway, but on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for hanging out with me. Hope you enjoyed the reading, and those listening to the replay, I hope you enjoyed listening to the fairy tales I picked for you all. Next time, I'll probably look through the Necronomicon, basically not the Evil Dead one, but the H.P. Lovecraft copy I have, and look to see what stories I can read from that. I have Edgar Allan Poe stories I can read, and so forth. So on that note, again, hope you enjoyed listening to the fairy tales. Have a good rest of your day or evening, wherever you are in the world, and I will see you all tomorrow evening, hopefully about 7:30 p.m. Eastern, there, give or take, for the Mortuary Assistants. Peace.